Welcome to Solar Life. Today we're on location in beautiful Charlotte County, southwestern New Brunswick. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing some solar panels up onto the roof with a special rack that I built for my friend Mike so that he can keep his solar panels out of the snow and off the ground and safe from the wind. So I built the rack out of standard 2-inch aluminum right angle stock, and it's designed to have 3 different positions. It'll be able to sit at winter position, spring and fall position, and also at summer position to get maximum efficiency out of the solar panels. But it's also going to be strong and rigid and be able to withstand the high winds that happen down here on the farm. So this is all handmade with a chop saw, a drill, measuring tape. It's kind of a do-it-yourself rack that I wanted to make to see if there's an easy way for everybody to rack up their own panels and build your own infrastructure, because this stuff can be pretty expensive to buy off the shelf. So as I mentioned, I built the rack at home. It's roughly 6 feet tall and about 9 feet wide, and I knew it was going to be bigger than it needed to be. So when we got it down here and I was able to size up the size of the roof, we realized that the rack had to be cut down a little bit. So we started by putting the blocking in that was going to accept the lag bolts that the whole rack was going to be screwed down with. And once we got those blocks in on both sides, we were able to get a final measurement for exactly how wide the rack had to be so that it could fit between all of the ridges in the steel roofing. The roofing wasn't quite perfectly square, so we had to be careful so that we had a good landing point for each of the bases of the 4 parts of the rack. So the rack was just a little bit too long, so we had to take apart one end of it, take all the bolts out, and shorten the rack a little bit, put it all back together so that we could put it up onto the roof, and then it would fit perfectly this time. So we had to re-drill a bunch of the holes that got changed because we shortened the frame by about 8 or 9 inches. Once we got all the bolts back in and tightened back up, we were able to mount the rack up onto the roof. It was fairly easy to get it up there. It didn't weigh very much. You probably could do this with one person, but since it was 2 of us, we did it together. Getting it lined up on the roof was fairly straightforward because we had spent quite a bit of time planning out where everything was going to hit and making sure that there was going to be something underneath it to support the lag bolts that we used. We used 4-inch galvanized lag bolts with a washer and a gasket underneath the right angle stock to prevent water from getting underneath everything. I brought down my impact driver to make this a nice easy job. You can crank these in by hand with a ratchet driver, but it's a lot of work. This, as you can see, only took a couple of seconds. Once the rack was secured, we were able to put the rails up. They secure down to the rack with right angle brackets that came with the hardware kit. Unfortunately, the bolts that are used inside of the hardware are specialty bolts, and they have a special head on them that allowed you to put the bolt into the track anywhere you wanted to and then tighten it down. But what that meant was we had to be really careful, because if we lost any of those bolts, we weren't going to be able to replace them. However, as we were to find out later by needing to come up with new ways to attach the solar panels down, we realized that you could fit certain size bolts into the track if you needed to. So you can go to the hardware store and get bolts that will fit into this track that aren't the specialty bolts that come with it. Fortunately, we didn't lose any bolts that day, and all we had to do was come up with new and inventive ways to hold down the solar panels, because the hardware that came for that was essentially not the right size, and so we had to be creative. Getting the panels up onto the roof was fairly straightforward because there was 3 of us to pass them up. And once we got them down onto the rack, we used a couple of pressure clamps that I brought with me to hold them securely on one side while we worked with the hardware on the other side. However, as soon as we put the first piece of hardware in place, we realized that the bolts that they sent with it were too short. The frame was thicker than the hardware would allow to clamp, and so we were going to have to customize each of the attachment points for all of the panels all the way across. So we had to go into the shop and find a bunch of nuts and bolts and create some custom brackets out of the right angle stock that I brought with me. And we were able to attach the first panel down. Then once we got the first panel down, we were able to put the mid clamps on using the existing mid clamps but some longer bolts. And then finally we got the monocrystalline panel up using the 4 end clamps that they sent with me, but I had to cut the end clamps to be a little bit shorter in order for them to hold the panel down onto the rack. Eventually, after about an hour and a half, we managed to get all of the panels secured. The problem with the hardware allowed us to come up with new solutions for how we're going to hold these panels down, and in a way I'm happy it happened because it made us get creative and come up with some new things that we would be able to make in the future when we need to add more panels to this without having to buy custom hardware, because what I made was a lot cheaper than what they sold me, and I think it'll work just as good, if not better. So here you can see the solar panels mounted with the different hardware that we had to create. This is the right angle bracket that I customized for the tall, thick panels. We also had to cut down those end clamps that were holding down the monocrystalline panels so that they would fit. Everything's bolted down, it's nice and sturdy. Once we got the rack secured and the panels on the rack, we tested the winter position on the rack so that we could see how easy it was to adjust the whole system by yourself. It was fairly heavy, but one person could do it if they wanted. Here you can see some of the safety straps that we have in place to prevent the panels from flipping over if you happen to be doing this while it's a little windy. And there's also a brace that we have up there to hold the weight of the panels while you move to both sides to put the bolts back in to hold the legs down. There's 3 different positions. There's a short leg for the summer, there's a mid-sized leg for the spring and the fall, and then there's the long leg for the winter. So that's it for this episode of Solar Life. We got the solar rack up on the roof. We had to narrow it a little bit because it was a little wider than I expected it to be. And another thing that we ran into that was a bit of a problem is that we had to build all custom mounts to mount the solar panels to the racks because all of the hardware that they sent me was the wrong size. So it took us about 2 hours to mount the panels. It should have taken about 20 minutes. But I'm super excited. It works good. We tried it in 2 of the 3 positions and it's going to work out great. It's super solid and it should hold Mike's panels forever. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Solar Life. Please join us again for our next episode. And if you like this episode, please subscribe.